You might think that Route 66, a famous American highway, doesn't need an introduction, but Museum of Northern Arizona is currently working with Petrified Forest National Park on a project that shows perhaps a more complex and darker side to Route 66 than the image of a couple of guys driving in a Corvette down a long two-lane blacktop highway. My presentation today is an exploration of these aspects of the Mother Road at the intersection of history, mythology, and archaeology. Let's get started with some history. Petrified Forest National Monument was proclaimed December 8, 1906, under the Antiquities Act of that same year. Early access to the monument was primarily into the second forest area from the railroad stop of Adamana via the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, which traversed the valley of the Purcell River. And we see here an image of Adam Hanna, for whom Adamana was named, and behind him, and the large petrified forest log, is that means of conveyance, a wagon and horse. The other route by which petrified forest could be accessed was the 1857 to 1858 Beale Wagon Road, which was known as the Overland Road by 1880, which skirted the edge of the Painted Desert north of the monument. What we're seeing here is a copy of the 1883 General Land Office map of the Painted Desert, showing the Overland Road, which is the dark line running diagonally across the township. Another road closely followed the north side of the AT&SF Railroad, which is down in the lower right of the map. And I've overlaid in red the current boundaries of Petrified Forest National Park to give you an orientation. So the roads between Lupton and Holbrook, Arizona, which included the Overland Road, were notoriously difficult to traverse due to deep shifting sands and multiple fords of the Purcell River, which were prone to deep mud and quicksand. These were considered among the most difficult sections of a proposed new route across the United States. In 1913, the National Old Trails Highway developed under the promotion of the Daughters of the American Revolution, the National Old Trails Road Association, and the Arizona Good Roads Association. The NOTH, for short, was an attempt to create a transcontinental automobile road along the 35th parallel, extending westward from the existing national road between Baltimore, Maryland, and Wheeling, West Virginia, using other existing roads. And I want to point out here that this followed a model of other named highways at the time, like the Lincoln Highway and the Dixie Highway. No actual roads were constructed. These organizations simply went out and marked, usually with vertical wooden poles painted in a candy stripe or some other design that linked together sections of roads that were maintained at a state, federal, county, even private roads were linked into these named national highways. And the proposed NOTH was no different. And the initial route of it was going to take it from northwest, from Gallup, New Mexico, up to St. Michael's, Arizona, then south through Sanders to St. John's, west to Concho, and then north and northwest along the Little Colorado River to Holbrook to rejoin the Overland Trail route. And this was what they proposed to avoid having to cross the Purcell River. This alignment passed through the southernmost portion of Petrified Forest National Monument in the Rainbow Forest area. A direct connection between Lupton and Holbrook was not constructed until 1922, when Navajo and Apache counties cooperatively built a graded dirt road that included several bridges over the Puerco and other large washes. And this is how it was described by custodian William Nelson in his 1920 annual report of the Petrified Forest National Monument. So as you can see, this construction was a very big deal, and it completed the last remaining section of this national highway. And as you will also note, the superintendent's quote demonstrates that the NOTH is interchangeably referred to as both a highway and a road, a situation that began with the road's boosters and continues to the present. And I'm going to try to be consistent here with calling it a highway, even though it was in fact not paved. The federal highway system came into existence in 1926, following years of good roads advocacy. Federal aid funds assisted states in constructing or reconstructing roads and required the use of a national system of road designations to be based on a numeric grid rather than names as it prevailed during the period when the private roads associations named and marked routes, as we've already noted. Under the scheme initially proposed, the road that would extend from Chicago, Illinois, ultimately to Los Angeles, and it crossed Arizona from Gallup to Needles, was part of US Route 60. The road from Socorro, New Mexico to Holbrook was US Route 70, and the road from Lordsburg, New Mexico to Phoenix was US 180. Obviously, those numbers have all changed, and several times in the intervening decades. But as the only road on a diagonal across the continent, the US 60 designation didn't actually fit their proposed numbering system, and the state of Kentucky objected to being the only state without a transcontinental route within its boundaries. On November 11th, 1926, portions of several existing roads between Chicago and Los Angeles were unified for the first time under a new name, Route 66. This map shows its complete length, including the later extension to Santa Monica. These roads included the existing route of the NOTH in Arizona, which remained a graded dirt road. On September 23, 1932, Petrified Forest National Monument was expanded by an act of Congress northward to include the Painted Desert and Black Forest, bringing the alignments of the Overland Road and NOTH within the monument boundaries. The Painted Desert portion of the monument very quickly became the new visitor focus, and correspondingly, with private development along Route 66. Now, I think it's important at this point to note that later modifications to Route 66 and developments within Petrified Forest National Monument were linked. Expansion of the monument in 1932 took place in anticipation of the realignment and paving of Route 66, which would then increase access into the monument, add the Painted Desert Rim Road, which at the time was a private development, and it would become part of the monument, and allow travelers to detour to or from Route 66 via the Monument Road and Highway 260. This is a National Park Service map that shows this configuration after the main park road was completed and paved, linking 260 down here, which we now know as Highway 180, up here with Route 66. And this is a bit of a strange map because north is oriented towards the left. You have to sort of turn your head to get it. In any case, it doesn't follow conventional map protocol where north is at the top. Route 66 was rebuilt as a paved two-lane automobile highway between 1931 and 1936, following the monument expansion. Similarly, development of the Painted Desert Community and Visitor Center, relocation of the headquarters from the south end of the park into the Painted Desert, realignment of the Painted Desert Rim Road now as part of the main park road, and elevation to national park status awaited and followed the 1956 to 1961 second realignment and upgrade of Route 66. This new alignment, which is now designated as Interstate 40, was a limited access, grade separated highway that required an overpass of the park road, which we can see here, and the removal of two dangerous at-grade intersections, creating a single access point on the north where visitors could be greeted, educated, refreshed, and if need be, searched for stolen petrified wood. Petrified Forest was one of the first segments of Route 66 to be replaced by I-40. The city of Williams was the last in 1985, the year that Route 66 was decommissioned as a federal highway. 1985 was also the year that Route 66 began a transformation into a myth. Route 66 had been celebrated during its heyday with songs, television shows, and by John Steinbeck as the Mother Road in The Grapes of Wrath. But beginning in the late 1980s, Route 66 shifted from being a road to move people and goods from point A to point B to a pilgrimage site. Much like the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain, which is traced every year by pilgrims in the footsteps of St. James, Route 66 began to attract vintage car and motorcycle enthusiasts, fans of mid-century roadside attractions, and those seeking a perceived simpler life embodied in motoring along a desolate two-lane highway under the broad Arizona skies. Well, actually, in this case, California skies. Thank you, Internet, for the free photo. Route 66 pilgrims now come from around the world, but especially from Central Europe, often renting motorcycles and attempting to find the remaining sections of old Route 66 that were cut off from I-40, such as that segment between Kingman and Seligman. The problem with nostalgia is that it usually creates a past that did not exist, and such is the case with Route 66. From the completion of the paved alignment in 1936, plans were immediately begun to improve the road, as highway usage increased every year until the onset of World War II. By the late 1940s, the road again carried heavy traffic, and many motorists were injured or killed in frequent crashes on the road that had become nicknamed Bloody 66. Motorists traveled in fear for their lives or with reckless indifference. Within Petrified Forest, the 6 miles of Route 66 witnessed at least 5 fatal accidents from 1938 to 1957. These were documented in the monthly reports prepared by the monument superintendents for use by regional or national offices of the National Park Service. And what we have on the screen here is a table that I prepared from those monthly reports of all of the reported car crashes, the causes of the crashes, number of vehicles, injuries, and fatalities. The slide I began my presentation with showed the most dangerous location in the monument, which was the intersection of the western end of the Painted Desert Loop Road with the main park road where it crossed Route 66. Most of these accidents took place at that location. People failed to stop for stop signs and were broadsided. People were passing and people didn't observe that when they were crossing. It was a very, very dangerous location. By 1955, when ground was finally broken for a replacement highway, the Park Service, motorists, and the Arizona Highway Patrol were eager for a safer road. But those of you like me who have spent hours on I-40 sandwiched between semi-trucks going 80 miles an hour probably disagree that we have a safer road. But imagine that volume of traffic on a 2-lane highway with opposing lanes, cars and trucks pulling out to pass. So much for the myth of Route 66. What about the archaeology? After traffic on Route 66 was shifted over to I-40, the pavement was scraped from the old 1936 roadbed, and some of the telephone lines and poles along the road were removed, as you can see in this image. But little else happened, and Route 66 and Petrified Forest has remained otherwise little disturbed since then. There are many segments of Route 66 that have been listed to the National Register of Historic Places, which is the Hall of Fame of American buildings, bridges, roads, and battlefields. A previous archaeologist at Petrified Forest recognized that Route 66 deserved additional research and protection, and he initiated a project to place that 6-mile-long segment onto the National Register. I have previous experience as both an archaeologist and a historian with many historic roads, including other segments of the NOTH and Route 66. So M&A was invited to prepare the National Register nomination. Archaeologists from M&A under my direction walked the entire 6 miles of both alignments of the NOTH Route 66 and identified 15 major features, most of which are culverts, like this one, consisting of poured concrete head and tail walls over a corrugated metal pipe. And one of the nifty things about these is that they have a surveyor cap inserted into each one that actually has the date that they were constructed. They were all built in 1934. Others are the remains of sign supports for roadside businesses like this. There are 2 Malpai footers for probably a big wooden billboard in this location. And here we can see some of the remaining intact telephone poles, which are along the left-south side of Route 66. This view is looking southwest towards Rocky's Stage Station in the western part of the Painted Desert portion of Petrified Forest National Park. Additionally, and more interestingly, we found the remains of 3 National Park Service checking stations at which rangers searched cars for stolen petrified wood, and 2 roadside businesses that were then on what was private or state land in holdings within the park. We then designated some shorter segments of the 2 alignments and identified, mapped, and fully documented all of the artifacts along the road. So in other words, we sampled, we didn't try to record every single artifact along those 6 miles. And artifacts, as you may have already guessed, is trash. Broken bottles, cans, car parts, and other objects that fell off of or out of cars and trucks. And in this image, we're looking at what was probably the contents of a paper bag that was thrown from a car with a couple of liquor flasks, a beer bottle, a beer can, a soda bottle, and a lipstick case. In all, we recorded 1,205 individual artifacts. The artifacts that are associated with Route 66 are a specialized deposit to provide uniquely archaeological insights to motorists and their behavior over the period from 1922 to 1961. Now, we're lucky because this scant 40-year interval is the sweet spot of the 20th century. Mass production of durable, high-quality goods and the ascendance of automotive culture. Now, true, we're not seeing everything that was thrown out of or fell out of cars because the paper goods, like the bag that probably contained these bottles, have disintegrated or just blown away. But much of what was made and sold in this time was over-engineered and likely to persist for a long time in the high desert. Now, the darkest of Route 66 is very eloquently sketched by Steinbeck in Grapes of Wrath, with the California-bound Okies and Arkies waiting on the edge of the terrifying Mojave Desert for night and cooler temperatures for the final run into Los Angeles in their overheating jalopies. While the Dust Bowl diaspora is very important to the significance of Route 66, the experiences that are memorialized today in the mythology are those of mid-century tourists and the kitschy roadside commercial properties of the Southwest. Two of these, the Lion Farm, as we see here in a postcard, and the Painted Desert Tower, bookend much of the length of Route 66 in Petrified Forest. These facilities and the Painted Desert Inn were the real destinations of the era, with restrooms, cold beer and soda, and souvenirs. The only National Park Service presence was a small inspection station, one of the checking stations, at the intersection of the originally private-owned Painted Desert Rim Road. And this is a wonderful view that was provided by the Petrified Forest Park archives during the 1940s when it was still in existence. It was a marvelous adobe plastered Pueblo Deco style building. Now, this location is actually considerably east of where the Painted Desert Rim Road is now. This has been cut off when they incorporated the Painted Desert Rim Road into the main park road. The National Park Service Painted Desert Visitor Center marked the end of the Route 66 that was documented by this project. It was built in conjunction with a relocation of Route 66 to the south and the removal of competing commercial interests. The material culture of wrecked cars, litter, and accidental losses provides insights to roadside behaviors that we can only hope are no longer acceptable in the 21st century. Reckless driving, drinking and driving, and littering. And sadly, during the pandemic, these have all made a comeback. Let's start with reckless driving. The large number of automobile parts documented along Route 66 and Petrified Forest reflects the frequency of car crashes on the road rather than breakdowns. Historic roads often have numerous associated breakdown camps where motorists spent hours or even days trying to repair broken vehicles. We did identify one of these in Petrified Forest, which included a shattered piston, evidence that someone had a very bad day, and judging by the number of artifacts associated with it, they were camped in this location for quite some time. What we encountered much more often was broken, melted, or otherwise damaged automobile parts left behind after crashes. This was found next to one of the alignments. It's the complete rear axle and brake assembly from a vehicle, and it was associated with mangled body panels, a steering column, and lots of pieces of broken glass. In fact, the 691 pieces of broken automobile glass we documented represents 8% of all the glass artifacts we found. Automotive glass includes windshield and window glass, headlights, taillights, and turn lamps. And you might be wondering how we knew that it was automotive. Well, cars of this era did not have the curved glass that we have come to associate with windshields and even side glass. Most glass up until the mid to late 50s was absolutely flat, and it was quite a bit thicker than current glass. This table that you can see behind me also includes other items that are associated with automobiles, including motor oil cans. Some of my audience may have grown up in the more recent era when cars don't even require a tune-up for the first 100,000 miles. But for vehicles of this era, you were pretty much going to have to add motor oil every time you filled the gas tank. And if you didn't check the oil, you were likely to end up in one of those breakdown camps. The first documented accident on Route 66 in Petrified Forest took place September 13th, 1932, just west of the monument boundary on Route 70, now 180, when a driver from Pine Top, Arizona, was killed and her passenger injured after the car overturned on a bad curve. This was reported in the monthly report by the custodian because the motorists were returning to Holbrook after visiting the monument, and because the custodian had been anticipating a crash at this bad curve and a similar curve within the monument boundaries. Now, one crucial thing to note is that the metal automobile parts that are on that table that we documented were either deposited after World War II or were overlooked during the scrap metal collection drives that took place during the war. Superintendent Whitcraft observed in October 1942 that, quote, during the last week of September, all personnel in the monument, including operators, made a search for scrap metal. At the close of the month, 23 ton had been collected and taken to Holbrook, where it was placed in the community pile as a donation, unquote. Plans were made to haul an additional 50 tons of very useful scrap metal the following month, as he reported here. I also want to point out here that these monthly superintendent's reports are absolutely full of these sort of amazing little facts, like Petrified Forest holding a national record for how much scrap metal they collected. These reports were prepared by custodians and superintendents from the 19-teens into the late 1960s and provide an absolutely invaluable record of everything that took place in these national park units during that period. They would note weather events, famous people who visited the park, changes in park status, changes in climate, all of these sorts of bits and pieces of information that by themselves are factoids. But if you are researching the National Park Service or a particular park unit, these are a must-have source of information, and they are available through the Western Archaeological Conservation Center in Tucson on their website as one of their finding guides. This is one of the objects that we found along Route 66. It is a 1929 Chevrolet Sedan, and it was overlooked, or more likely, it is so deeply embedded into the ground that they couldn't collect it. Undoubtedly, one of the factors involved with the reckless driving and subsequent crashes was my next topic, which is the frequency with which motorists drank alcoholic beverages. Beverage containers of glass and steel are the most common artifacts along Route 66. And although the contents and brand names remain visible on only a few, the majority are containers for alcoholic beverages. And we see here too a non-returnable beer bottle on the left and a liquor flask on the right. There are relatively few mentions of criminal drunkenness or driving under the influence in those monthly superintendent's reports. But in March 1960, they reported Mr. Alvin B. Reynolds of Luna, New Mexico was apprehended on US Highway 260 within the park boundaries and held for state authorities on charges of driving under the influence of liquor. And in March 1961, one motorist was fined $200 for reckless driving and driving under the influence. Now, despite the lack of mention in official records, out of the 8,471 pieces of glass we documented, liquor and wine bottles and flasks represent 18.6% of all the glass objects. That's 1,579 pieces of glass. And beer bottles, 3.2%. That's another 269. Of the 1,214 cans, beverage cans were slightly over half, 619. And although few of these had labels, and some contained soda rather than beer, the majority did in fact contain beer. And we see 3 examples here where beer is evident on what remains of the labels. Now, based on the number of cans where we could read the label as a beer can versus the number of cans where we could read the label as a soda can, we calculated a ratio of 3.25 beer cans to every 1 soda can. Keep in mind also, soft drinks were not canned until 1954. Beer cans date to 1935. That's when they first came to the market. So the actual ratio is much higher. So at least 35% of the cans we calculate as beer containers. Now, Prohibition banned the package sales of alcoholic beverages for 11 of the years that Route 66 NOTH was in use, 1922 to 1933. So most of the alcohol containers were deposited between 1933 and 1961. In fact, as I'll discuss in a moment, there was actually a marked uptick in alcohol containers after 1935, which, as I mentioned, the year in which canned beer first came to the market. And it is also the year that disposable bottles were developed for beer as a counter to those beer cans by the bottling industry. In addition to packaged liquor, which was available at the Lion Farm and other roadside commercial businesses along Route 66, the Painted Desert Inn briefly had a public tap room. Painted Desert Inn was originally a private roadside business that was initiated by the same person who constructed the Painted Desert Rim Road, and it was known as the Stone Tree House. After it was acquired by the MPS, it was completely reconstructed in Pueblo Deco style in the late 1930s. The tap room and restaurant was part of this reconstruction, but its reopening was delayed until November 6, 1940, due to problems in securing that liquor license. Beer was also apparently for sale at the Rainbow Forest Lodge. In 1947, the Fred Harvey Company assumed operation of the Painted Desert Inn following the dismissal of the manager, Edward McGrath, for public drunkenness, and at that point they ended the sale of liquor. Beer, however, continued to be served. At least one returnable soft drink bottle that we found contained tonic water, and it bore a painted label that states, "Makes a perfect gin and tonic." Further evidence that some motorists, or at least their passengers, were enjoying cocktails with their journey is demonstrated by the finds of a stainless steel cocktail strainer, a bottle opener, a church key, and a rotary can opener with a combined bottle opener church key handle. And a church key is the triangular punch still found in most kitchens that was used to open beer cans from 1935 into the 1960s before they had a pull ring. Which is actually what brings us to littering. Prior to 1935, nearly all beverage bottles manufactured were owned by the local bottling company and were required by law to be returned for cleaning and filling. So in other words, you bought the contents of the bottle, not the bottle. You had to return the bottle. Most soda was still sold in returnable bottles well into the mid-1950s, with many of these decorated with elaborate molded and painted labels. This is a small sample of what we observed. With the advent of beer in cans, glass manufacturers saw a threat to their business, a threat that they addressed by creating one-way or non-returnable bottles that were often marked "no deposit, no return." Well, with no deposit and no need to return, empties went out the window and into the borrow ditch. Likewise to flasks and fifth bottles of liquor, which were embossed with a government threat of penalty if they were to be refilled. Now, this actually dates from Prohibition, when bootleggers would buy empty bottles to fill with moonshine. Out the window it goes, because you wouldn't want anybody to get the wrong idea if they saw your backseat full of empties, especially the police. We also found 10 toys or other items that are assumed to be accidental losses out of open car windows or in car crashes, based on what they are. And these include a toy soldier, a toy cow that had a matching barrel with it, a tennis bracelet, cap gun, marble, and ceramic religious figurine. And most of these were located actually pretty close to the lion farm, and we suspect that as people were pulling away or pulling out into traffic rather quickly, if things weren't well secured in the car, especially with children in the back seat, these may have fallen out of the car. Now, while we, I hope, all find that littering is deplorable, the shoulders of Route 66 provide some interesting insights to how products were sold and marketed in the mid-20th century. For example, soft drink bottles provide a wealth of information. Soft drink brands could be identified on 169 bottles, with Coca-Cola the most common at 35%. And this is really largely a result of Coke's marketing strategy, where they had a unique bottle shape as well as a unique color and molded on labels so that even small parts of a Coke bottle are readily recognizable as coming from one. We also found a number of other national brands or emerging national brands, including Kist, there were 16 of those, Pepsi Cola, there were 16, Barks, 13, 7-Up, there were 11, and Sparkle, of which there were 8. But most of the other brands we saw were represented by just one or a few bottles. And this reflected a period in soft drink bottling of very diverse local brands. And we've seen some of those on the previous photo. Soda bottle bases or labels also provided the locations of 27 bottlers in 14 states. Arizona, unsurprisingly, had the largest number, 28, with 11 coming from Flagstaff, 6 from Holbrook, 4 from Phoenix, 4 from Winslow, and 1 from Tucson. And it's interesting to note that smaller towns that now barely have a functioning gas station each had their own soda bottler during the 1930s to the 1960s. So in conclusion, what I've presented today is but a small part of what we observed and learned about Route 66 and the motorists who drove it between 1922 and 1961. M&A is working now to nominate Route 66 in Petrified Forest National Park and the associated MPS checking stations, Painted Desert Rim Road, Lion Farm, and Painted Desert Tower to the National Register of Historic Places as a district. This is classic mission creep. Originally, I was going to do just the road. Now I have this entire district that I need to nominate. Very little remains of these as physical places. So here we see on the left, the Painted Desert Tower as it was in its operational heyday and as it is now, just foundations. But all of these places contain a wealth of information in those associated artifacts, the trash, that informs on and even challenges the mythology of the Route 66 experience.
Do any building structures still exist on the original Route 66 route?
Yes, they do, just not within the park. There are many places that you can go see Route 66 structures. In fact, right here in Flagstaff, many of the old motels along Route 66 within Flagstaff were constructed along what was then Route 66 and were used during its heyday. Probably one of the best places to go is Seligman, which is the home base of the Route 66 Association that was started by Angel Delgado, who was the local barber and who has a wonderful drive-in restaurant there in Seligman. But no standing buildings from this period remain in Petrified Forest National Park. So these are strictly archaeological sites. And it's actually an interesting question because when we started this project, we were intending to nominate Route 66 as a highway. The problem is, in order for it to go on the National Register, it still has to be visible to members of the public as a highway. With the removal of the pavement and subsequent growth of plants, especially sagebrush, it is barely visible. I think you probably saw a couple of photos that I put in where it's just sort of a dark green line on the ground. So we had to switch gears and aim for nominating it for its archaeological information. And again, that's why I'm focusing on the trash, because that archaeological information is entirely within those pieces of trash along the roadside.
Can you tell the story of why there is no remaining trace of the Lion Farm?
Yes, it's a very complicated story. The Lion Farm was originally built on a piece of state land. And when the National Park Service expanded Petrified Forest National Monument to include the Painted Desert, that fell within the boundaries of the park. And it began a many decades long, very contentious relationship between the Park Service and the owners of the Lion Farm. The owners of the Lion Farm felt that they were being infringed upon by the Park Service, who wanted views of the Painted Desert without any sort of commercial property within that viewscape. The Park Service viewed the Lion Farm as tawdry, trashy, kitschy, all sorts of things that the Park Service does not greatly value. And in the end, the Park Service prevailed. The state land lease was canceled by the Arizona State Land Department. The property was deeded over to the Park Service, and the entire place was burned to the ground. So again, nothing remains above ground in terms of buildings from the Lion Farm.
What was the most surprising thing you discovered in your research of this project?
Most surprising thing, I think it's that there was actually more associated properties in terms of those commercial properties, the National Park Service checking stations, with this stretch of Route 66 than we had anticipated. Even today, when you drive that part of I-40, there's not a whole lot out there. And most of what is in that stretch between Holbrook and the New Mexico state line is either out of business, waiting to be burned down. Most of those businesses are not thriving. So it was really surprising to see that this particular area had at one point really been a focus of people pulling off the road to look at the Painted Desert, and both the Park Service and private entrepreneurs took advantage of that. So I'd say that's probably the most surprising thing that we've discovered.
Do you personally know what the penalty was for stealing some petrified artifacts? I'm assuming they're talking about the petrified wood.
Absolutely. Again, those monthly superintendent reports, pretty much every single month, document theft of petrified wood. And there were two different kinds of theft that were taking place. So there was commercial theft. As I mentioned, there were all those little trading posts and gas stations and whatnot along Route 66. Well, many of them were making money by selling polished pieces of petrified wood. And if you go to the south entrance to Petrified Forest National Park today, you pass a whole bunch of those right at the turnoff onto Highway 180 and actually right on 180 where you enter the south part of the park. Well, some of these places had exhausted the supply of petrified wood on their own land. And so they ended up either leasing other people's land or on occasion going into the monument and stealing logs of petrified wood that they would then sell. And at one point in the 1930s, they had a real problem with this, people going in after dark in the middle of the night and stealing big logs. And they finally caught them by following the tire tracks out of the park and right up to the trading post where they found the logs sitting out in front. The other type of theft that they had is the more common one, and it's the one that they still battle today, which is visitors to the monument just picking up, a piece or two here and there. And that is why they were checking cars, because sometimes those pieces added up and somebody's entire back seat would be full of petrified wood. And the Park Service kept a truck at each one of those checking stations in which they would put all of the petrified wood that they confiscated, and then they would take it out to a secret location and dump it every week. Now, the penalty, interestingly, Arizona passed a state law specifically targeting the theft of petrified wood back in the 1930s. And I believe the original penalty was something like $100, which was quite a bit in the 1930s. But those monthly superintendent reports are full of accounts of them apprehending people with petrified wood who wouldn't give it up. And then they would actually call the sheriff. The sheriff would take them to St. John's or to Holbrook, depose them in court, and fine them on the spot.
Are any of the artifacts that your team discovered displayed anywhere?
They are not. We did not collect anything except a single bottle, and that bottle is kept by the Park Service in their archaeology collections, but it is not up for display at this point. I do know that with the completion of our National Register nomination, the Park Service is interested in highlighting this as one of the resources of the park. So in the future, there may be a display in the visitor center that would highlight some of these artifacts. And I do, at this point, unfortunately have to point out that removal of any item, including artifacts, trash, bottles, any of those sorts of things from the national park is a crime, and it is a lot more than $100 penalty. So please resist the temptation. Leave them where they are, where they provide information and context to Route 66. And I would like to thank you for attending today. I would also like to send out some call outs to Petrified Forest National Park for many of the images in here from their archives. Also the assistance of former park archaeologist Melissa Johnson, who helped us in the field with the mapping of all these artifacts. I'd like to thank Navajo County Historical Society, which provided many images. And I would like to thank Dr. Lillian Makeda, who conducted her PhD dissertation research on the Lion Farm and the Painted Desert Tower, produced several wonderful publications, very detailed research, and she also generously shared with me several of her images from her personal collection. So thank you.